The Conjuring 2 is a terrifying example of a fictional horror movie, but the paranormal events that inspired the film are all too real. Come and sit with me as we get into the true story of chilling poltergeist activity and an investigation that left paranormal investigators shaken to their core. Hello, my friend. How has your day been today? Are you doing good? Are you staying hydrated? If you're new around here, hi, welcome. I'm Claire, and I'm a lover of all things morbid, mysterious, and macabre. I have spent hours and hours absolutely enthralled with ghost hunting TV shows, paranormal investigations, like YouTube videos, you name it, I've watched it. But you know what I love more than the night vision camera footage and all the EVPs that they capture? I love the history behind a paranormal encounter, the origins of urban legends, and the real, raw, personal ghost stories that people have experienced firsthand. So that is what we are going to do. Every week we sit down and swap ghost stories like a good old sleepover. So if that's your scene, I would highly recommend that you subscribe so that you never miss a chat. And I'm celebrating my YouTube launch and I am posting every single day for 30 days. So we have so much to cover that you are not going to want to miss. And when I come across excellent sources, I will always recommend them. This week, the Channel 4 documentary that aired in 2007 called Interview with a Poltergeist was absolutely excellent. I've also taken information from a book written by someone who was at the home for over a year. The book is called This House is Haunted by Guy Lyon Playfair. I would have the book to show you, but I was too impatient and I didn't order it in time for it to come, so I had to use an ebook. Also, just a disclaimer, although I'm not really sure how relevant it's going to be here, but we are going to be talking spoilers about The Conjuring 2. So if you haven't seen the film yet and you don't want it spoiled, first of all, how the hell have you gone this long without watching it? It came out in 2016. Come on. But if you still haven't seen it, stop watching this video, go and watch the film. Literally pay the £3.50 to watch it on Amazon Prime and then come back here so that we can get into it. So I have a love-hate relationship with fear. I love throwing on horror movies, but I hate being scared. And I scare super easily. I can watch a scary horror film, but then I will have to watch an episode of Family Guy before I go to bed. And I already have to sleep with the light on, a little night light on every night. I will admit that. I am a wimp. Why do you think my YouTube name is what it is? But I just cannot get enough of horror movies. I love them. The Paranormal Activity franchise was just starting to come out as I was getting into high school and figuring out how much I loved all these spooky things. Insidious, Sinister, all of those franchises were great, but it was The Conjuring for me. I found the first Conjuring excellent. I absolutely loved it. When those little hands came out of the dark and clapped, I about wet myself. That image is burned into my brain. Terrifying. So it was no question that I wanted to go to the cinema to see The Conjuring 2. What the fuck was I thinking? When I tell you, I very nearly walked out of the cinema. I have never felt the fear that I felt when I was watching The Conjuring 2. It very nearly got too much for me. I mean, you're paying that much for a cinema ticket. I'm not about to walk out, but I was so close to walking out. And the movie makes a point of saying that it is loosely based on a true story. And that true story is known as the Enfield Poltergeist. Now, I'd heard about the Enfield Poltergeist growing up. It's a very famous case in the UK, so it featured in almost every ghost book that you'd read, complete with that infamous photo of Janet allegedly being levitated across her bedroom. And even I didn't realise quite how much apparently happened in that house until I looked again at the case after watching The Conjuring 2, obviously for the second time in broad daylight. So we're going to get into the entire story of the Enfield Poltergeist, all the history that we know and the personal accounts from the family themselves, and to talk about the film and what it was actually accurate about. We're also going to obviously talk about the case itself, because I think that's one reason why it's such a talked about case, is what you've got is credible witnesses to all these weird goings on, with police officers going on record about their experience. But then on the other hand, a lot of the evidence is refuted by skeptics, it's just kids pulling pranks. But we will get into it all. So in case you don't know, Enfield is a suburb in North London. And the house sat at number 284 Green Street, and it just looked like any other council house like on the estate. There was nothing particularly special about it. In 1977, the house was occupied by Peggy Hodgson, who was a divorced mother of 4, along with her children, Margaret, who was 13, Janet was 11, Johnny was 10, and Billy was 7. So by all accounts, they were like a normal family living at 284. They were there for 12 years with like not even a sniff of anything going on. Like for 12 years, they just lived there normally. But all that was about to change. As the Hodgsons were getting ready for bed on the evening of the 31st of August 1977, Peggy heard like a commotion coming from one of the bedrooms. And according to Guy in the book, it was Janet and Johnny that were saying that they could like hear a shuffling sort of sound coming from the floor of the bedroom. Although in the documentary and the film, it was Janet and her sister Margaret that were in the room. So I'm inclined to believe the book because Guy was there and like wrote the book quite soon after it happened, but I don't know. Now, Peggy's patience was already running a little thin with her kids on this particular evening, as they'd also been messing around at bedtime last night too, claiming that the beds were shaking. But at this point, like, nothing had happened, so she just thought, like, the kids were just being kids. And you can see it from her point of view. Like, kids will mess around at bedtimes when, like, they don't feel tired, when they don't want to go to bed. And the end of August, like, this might have been, like, the 6 weeks holiday, like, so they're, like, summer vacation sort of thing. So they're probably wired anyway. They're excited. They don't have school. It's fine. So when Peggy went in to settle the kids down, she turned the light off to try and, like, get them to sleep. And that's when she started hearing the shuffling noise too. But there wasn't just a shuffling noise. All 3 of them heard 4 loud knocks on the wall. And then, just like it happened in the film, the chest of drawers that was in the bedroom moved about 18 inches towards the doorway of the bedroom. And like, Peggy was completely bewildered at this point, like knowing the kids could have had nothing to do with it. They were still in bed and she just watched the chest of drawers move across the room. So she just like pushed it back to where it had come from. No sooner had she done that the chest of drawers moved again. And this time when she tried to push it back, it would not budge. Like it was as if someone was on the other side, like stopping it from moving. It was not going anywhere. But that was more than enough for Peggy to decide to like get her children out of the house. Like she's a single mother. If there's someone in this house not interested, we're getting out. So they were still in their dressing gowns and all 5 of the Hodgsons marched next door. And so their next door neighbours were Peggy again. So she was known as Peggy next door to avoid confusion with Peggy Hodgson. And her husband Vic, who was like a builder in his 40s. So that was the same as in the film. And after listening to Peggy's story, Vic decided he was going to go round to the house and like try and get to the bottom of the disturbance, like what's going on. Not only did he not find the potential source for the noise, he also heard the noise himself. Like he would move from room to room, obviously like looking for it, but the knocking on the walls would follow him. And like this guy was a builder. He knew buildings and their noises, like where it was like pipes or doors would like knock as they expand or like anything like that. This was not those noises. And seeming like she was sort of left with no option at this point, Peggy Hodgson decided to call the police. So Caroline Heaps was a police officer on duty that evening, and along with her partner, she responded to the call about this domestic disturbance at the Hodgson house. And like they listened to the story of like what had happened, and like from what they could see, like these adults were like clearly disturbed by what they'd sort of experienced. So the police officers went in and like did a search of the house, but they found nothing. Like just like Vic, there was nothing to find. They were in the house, and that's when the police officer, Caroline, saw a chair come up off the floor about half an inch and slide about 3 to 4 feet across the room. And this was a police officer that went on record and claimed that this is what she saw. Like, she checked the chair for, like, wires or any other reason for the chair to have moved 4 feet across the room, but there was no explanation. That chair, logically, should not have been moving. And at this point, there was nothing the police could do. And, like, while they said they'd, like, keep an eye on the house over the next few days, like, they left. I mean, if there's no criminal to arrest or, like, no crime being committed, like, what can the police do, really? But the thing is, like, no one was really thrilled about the thought of sleeping in their bedrooms that night. So the Hodgson family, they all tried to get, like, a few hours of sleep downstairs together in the living room. And so in the morning, like, you're in the cold light of day, you're just wondering, like, oh, was it really as bad as we thought it was last night? Everything seemed a little clearer in the morning. It would not last long. Soon after they'd got up, marbles and bits of Lego were being flung around the room, and it was coming from nowhere. Like, they couldn't figure out where these things were being thrown from. And this continued for days, with all the family continuing to sleep together in the living room at night. Like, I don't blame them. Obviously, like, they had no luck from the police. Peggy next door thought about getting the papers involved to see if, like, the Daily Mirror knew who they could sort of, like, contact to try and get some help for the Hodgson family so they could go back to, like, normal life. So the Daily Mirror sent reporter Douglas Bence and photographer Graham Morris. They arrived at the Nottingham residence next door, so Peggy and Vic's house, and they just found, like, a distraught Peggy Hodgson and just absolutely terrified children. Like, they could see that this was very clearly upsetting this family. So obviously they listened to the story and they were decided that, like, okay, now it's time for us to see the house. Let's see what's going on in the house. So the journalists, like, went to the house and waited. Nothing happened. No bricks were thrown, no marbles, like, nothing happened. The house was just completely normal. So they just thought it was a bust, like the Hodgson family was just clearly very good actors. The journalists started loading up their car with all their equipment when Vic came running out of the house saying the activity had started again. You need to come back in, like it's starting up again. So Graham grabbed his camera and they both went into the house, and to say they got the shock of their lives is an understatement. So there were, like, toy bricks and marbles, again, flying around the room, bouncing off walls, and one even hit Graham in the eyebrow. I mean, like, Lego bricks are sharp as hell when they catch you, so that must have hurt. And Graham had been taking photos at the time, and, like, seeing all of these things, like, going around in the air, he was, like, quite hopeful that he was going to actually catch something on film. But when he developed the photos, like, he was sorely disappointed. There was nothing on them. Like, he didn't catch anything. There was nothing conclusive saying where all of these, like, bits were coming from. So the journalists decided to return back to the Hodgson household to see if they could, like, record evidence of what they had seen the other night. Like, they knew what they saw at this point. Like, they were 100% convinced. They just needed to record the evidence. And it was at this point that the word poltergeist was first mentioned to the family. So they decided to enlist the help of the Incorporated Society for Psychical Research to try and, like, help the family find answers. So a man called Maurice Grosse was a new member of the SPR, and he'd lost his 22-year-old daughter to a motorbike accident in 1976. So he had joined, like, the SPR to, like, try and see if he could communicate with his daughter and see if he could just find answers. Within an hour of receiving the call about this, like, suspected haunting in Enfield, Morris was on his way. He was going to investigate. And he could feel the palpable fear again in the atmosphere from the Hodgsons. And after experiencing the poltergeist activity himself, like, he saw all these things flying around, he knew he could help. He attended an SPR lecture that evening, which ironically enough was on poltergeists, where he put out the call to other members to, like, try and form, like, a little group, a little team to sort of help him out with investigating. But other than a South London dental surgeon who was a little bit too far away and probably a bit too busy with work to, like, actually be any use, no one really wanted to get involved. But in the coming days in that house, there was more and more poltergeist activity happening. On the 10th of September 1977, the Enfield poltergeist made the front cover of the Daily Mirror, and the story involved some of, like, the experiences that the journalist had encountered in the house. And if I listed out everything that happened in that house, this would turn into, like, a 12-hour long video. Like, pretty much everything that you could think of that could happen happened. Things were flying around, chairs were being balanced on top of doors, like, even the lid of the poor fish tank went flying across the room when, like, no one was near it. And after the article in the Daily Mirror, Maurice Grosse, Peggy Hodgson and Peggy Nottingham, the next door neighbour, featured on a popular nighttime, like, phone-in radio show where they talked about even more of the unexplained happenings, like, carrying on some of the momentum from the newspaper article. And that's when Guy Lyon Playfair, the author of the book This House is Haunted, got involved, because he heard the radio show and he'd just been through a poltergeist investigation himself in Brazil, and he knew what Morris was up against, what he was going through. So Guy volunteered to help Morris with the investigation. After that, like, more experts started to get involved, and the more it became clear to them that they were dealing with a poltergeist. So with poltergeist, traditionally, they centre usually around a young girl who's about to or is currently going through puberty. Janet and Margaret were 11 and 13 respectively, so yeah, tick. As a side note, I remember first reading about the Enfield poltergeist in like primary school, and I was terrified because obviously at that point I hadn't been through puberty, and I was so scared that when I did, that meant that you were going to be haunted. Like, that was it. You hit puberty, you get a ghost. Spoiler alert, I did not experience any poltergeist when I went through puberty. With poltergeist activity, it usually gets more and more intense as well, like the longer it goes on. And as you'll soon see, this is absolutely a tick. Poltergeist activity usually includes things moving, disappearing and reappearing, like knocks, noises, and even smells sometimes. Tick, yep, they got that too. Another telltale symptom is a major upheaval in life, which that would have been down to Janet's mum and dad separating not long before the activity started. And so, true to poltergeist form, the activity started escalating. But there was also more suspicion around Janet herself as well. In one instance where Guy and Graham were at the top of the stairs, and apparently, like, she looked like she was asleep. So Guy instructed Graham to go down the stairs, like, step on each step twice and, like, pretend to talk to me while you're going down the stairs, so it sort of looks like both of the men have got to the bottom and they're not upstairs anymore. As soon as Graham reached the bottom of the stairs, Janet's head popped up from her pillow. She wasn't actually asleep. She was waiting for those two men to go downstairs so that she could do whatever she was going to do. Like, what was she planning to do if both men had gone downstairs? And even in the interviews as an adult, like, Janet fully admits that she, quote unquote, played tricks on the investigators. So, like, she fully admits that she did make some of the things up. But later on that night, they heard something drop to the floor in Janet's bedroom. And it was just like a one and done drop. Turns out it was a marble. So at some point in the night, like, Guy and Graham must have gone back upstairs as they were outside in the hallway when this happened. But it was a marble. Like, how could it have just hit the floor once without bouncing? So they tried to, like, recreate it, but every time they dropped the marble, it, like, bounced 3 or 4 times. There was no way Janet could have got out of bed, placed it right near the doorway of the bedroom without the two men seeing her, and make the noise as well. So it's instances like that that make me lean towards this house being a genuine haunted case, but maybe just with a mischievous little urchin playing tricks, you know? I don't know, what do you think? Please leave your thoughts in the comments below. By this point though, there seemed to be, like, constant activity in the house. Like, violent knocking on the walls was an everyday occurrence. After yet another episode of, like, loads of toys flying around the room, Guy decided to remove everything from the room that the entity could use to move. So, like, he just took everything that wasn't nailed down pretty much. Like, when he was done, all that was left were the beds, the Hodgsons themselves, and an old, like, disused gas fire that was just built into the wall, so you couldn't remove that. So he was like, yep, that's a job well done. See you later, Hodgsons, and Guy left for the night. He'd just arrived home at about midnight when Maurice Grosse called him, saying that the family were back over at the next door neighbours in a complete panic. In the absence of, like, toys to throw around the bedroom, the iron grill had been ripped out of the bottom of the fireplace and flew at one of the Hodgson's boys' pillows, like, narrowly missing his head. But it wasn't done there. The following morning, the entity proceeded to rip the entire iron frame around, like, the gas fireplace out of the wall. Like, this thing was cemented into the wall, and now it was just hanging there at an angle, attached only by, like, the mains pipe that had been bent. Like, there was no way that not even Peggy Hodgson herself could have done that, like, let alone the kids. But by late October, the constant activity was just getting too much for the family, and it was starting to affect Janet's performance at school as well. Maurice Grosse finally managed to arrange for the family to, like, take a holiday to Clacton-on-Sea for a week, which was great. The family had a great break, but once they returned, the activity intensified again. Guy decided, like, enough was enough, and he tried to confront the entity. He asked the spirit to knock once for no and twice for yes. After asking if the spirit had died in the house, what it wanted, who it was, they received this like barrage of knocks and yet more objects flying around the room and actually hitting Peggy and Margaret. This time Morris decided to try and make contact with this spirit that was responsible for all the knocking. He asked what 5 + 5 was, to which it replied with 10 knocks. Like, that's intelligence. So he asked, did you die in the house? Will you go away now? How many years ago did you live here? 10? More than 10? More than 20? More than 30? Can you spell out to me the number of years ago that it was? 53 knocks. He then went on to ask, did you die this year? He then asked the question, why are you in this house? You know you really shouldn't be here. The entity responded with 2 knocks again. Now, he said, are you having a game with me? And instead of any knocks, a cardboard box shot off the floor, sailed about 8 feet, and hit Morris right in the forehead. Like, Guy and Morris were completely in the thick of it with the Hodgsons at this point. There was no doubt in their minds that this was completely authentic, entirely a paranormal investigation. But not everyone was completely convinced about the legitimacy of this haunting. There was 2 SPR members, Anita Gregory and John Belloff, and they visited the house in Enfield and reported just a completely opposite narrative, that it was all just a massive hoax and the kids were basically pranking everyone. After spending just a short time in the house, they both came to the conclusion that it was nothing more than just Janet and Margaret. They were just like playing tricks on these poor men that were just being strung along. It's quite funny. There was this like pretty lengthy back and forth between Anita and Morris that was published in the SPR's quarterly journal. She'd called the evidence that had been gathered at the house questionable, greatly exaggerated, and pathetic. Anita claimed that a video camera had been set up in the room next door and it had caught Janet red-handed, like bending spoons and attempting to bend an iron bar and practicing levitation by bouncing on her bed and like flapping her arms. According to Anita, Janet was merrily like cheating away and not giving the slightest indication that she was aware that she was being filmed at that point. Which we get an interesting nod to in the film because it's what prompts Ed and Lorraine Warren to leave the house, which I actually really enjoyed that little twist in the film that Janet had been told by the entity to get rid of the investigators and that's why she faked it. I don't think that was the case in reality. I think she probably just saw the reaction of the investigators to the paranormal activity and was just feeding off that. I mean, in an interview with The Telegraph, like decades later, Janet said that she'd made up the activity. Like, sometimes when things would go quiet, as a kid, like, she'd feel that, like, you'd somehow failed. So you felt obliged to make things up so that people wouldn't be so skeptical. Like, Morris and Guy were staying in this house for this paranormal activity and they weren't getting anything. So, like, you would want to give them something. So I sort of get where she's coming from. Obviously, it's very misguided, but I understand. Regardless of this, Anita was not sympathetic to this 11-year-old child. Her eventual report on the Enfield haunting was so scathing that the Society of Psychical Research actually suppressed it because they were worried it would lead to a libel case. Like, that's how bad Anita dragged this family. It was brutal. But, like, Morris and Guy weren't under any illusions. Like, they admitted that in some instances, like, their kids had made up stories. Like, they knew it. One that stands out to me from Morris, he'd said that Janet had come running up to him saying that the poltergeist had stolen his tape recorder. But unbeknownst to the kids, the tape recorder was still recording when they stole it. So Morris had actually caught them on tape by basically saying that they were going to steal it and hide it and say that it was the ghost. But paranormal or not, the events continued to just get worse and worse. Just 2 weeks after their holiday to Clacton-on-Sea, the entity had taken to allegedly throwing Janet around the room. And this carried on for nights on end. So in order to get to the bottom of the girls' involvement, like how much were they making up, a medical doctor was brought in to hypnotise Janet. And while she did admit to some parts being down to herself and her sister Margaret, even the doctor concluded that like there were some things that happened in that house that they could not have done. And this was the thing that kept the case interesting for me. Like, yes, I fully acknowledge that one, the kids were making stuff up, and two, that none of the photographic evidence is compelling enough for me to say that, like, yes, this place is clearly haunted. But it's the testimony of people like this, like the doctors, the police officers, that makes me think that there is more credibility to these claims. As during the hypnosis session, Janet reported that when she was getting thrown out of bed, like, she could feel cold hands, like, all around her stomach, her arms and legs, as if people were, like, pulling her and throwing her out of bed. When she asked what she thought was causing the trouble, the answer surprised everyone. She said, "Me and my sister." So the doctor was like thinking they were going to get a confession about faking the whole thing, like coming out. So they sort of like delved a little bit deeper. Turns out that Janet actually held herself responsible for the poltergeist activity through being unhappy, basically. While she was still under, she went on to explain that both her and Margaret were frightened of their dad, and that they would always try to be somewhere else out of the house on Saturday when he would call with his like weekly child maintenance money for Peggy. Peggy had also mentioned earlier to Guy that their dad would bring his other woman around to the house, which is just cruel and is bound to mess with the kids' heads. Like, why would you do that? And it was then that the poltergeist started to communicate through Janet, and it came through as like a super rough, like kind of old man voice. And thinking that the gruff voice was just like Janet trying to add ventriloquism to her repertoire, Morris made Janet take a drink of water and then put tape over her mouth. The gruff voice still occurred. The investigators tried to mimic this voice, and they found that they had like sore throats after just like a few minutes of doing this. So they were completely bewildered as to how Janet could do this for like an hour without so much as like a scratchy throat or like a croaky voice afterwards. Because like as soon as the quote unquote entity had gone, like her voice was completely back to normal, back to 11-year-old Janet. But this is where Bill comes in. So Bill Wilkins was allegedly the spirit that was coming through Janet. Through questioning Bill, they discovered that he had come back to the house that he used to live at to see his family, but obviously they were not there anymore. Bill knew that he was dead and that he was buried at Durant's Park, which is a cemetery not far from the house, and that he couldn't go to heaven because he wasn't a heaven man, which is exactly like the film. After this, Morris went to his son, Richard Gross, who had just qualified as a solicitor. He's the perfect person to question someone. So Richard had been given like this day-by-day debrief of what was going on in the house, like around the breakfast table each morning by his dad. Like his dad would come home like in the middle of the night or whatever after like doing all these investigations. Richard would come down to breakfast and Morris would just talk at him about like everything that had happened in the house the night before. So Richard had kind of kept an open mind to the paranormal side, and that was because he'd had a few weird coincidences around his sister's death. So remember Morris's daughter dying in the accident the year before, obviously that was Richard's sister, but he was still pretty apathetic to what the Hodgsons were going through. On the 13th of December 1977, Richard proceeded to conduct this cross-examination on the entity. It refused to speak unless Richard left the room and closed the door, to which he did what he was told. And the voice that claimed to be Bill was pretty unfocused. It was jumping from one subject to another, and it was using a lot of bad language. Eventually, though, the voice settled, and when asked how he died, Bill said that he had gone blind, had a hemorrhage, and fallen asleep in the chair downstairs. Now, this bit is really, really interesting. The previous homeowner had been called Bill, who lived in the house that the Hodgsons were currently living in, and had died in that chair in the living room downstairs. Like, they'd even tracked down Bill's family, and his son Terry confirmed this story, saying that yes, like, his mum had just popped to the shops, just like pick up a couple of bits, and when she'd come home, Bill had passed away in his sleep in the chair downstairs. Creepy, right? Like, that is weirdly specific information that isn't usually publicly available, so it's not impossible, of course, but unlikely that Janet would have known that. So one incredible event that multiple people were witness to was when Janet apparently passed through solid walls. So her bedroom was joined to Peggy next door's bedroom, like on the dividing wall of the house. And during one episode of this levitation in which Peggy next door, she was round at the Hodgsons, Janet just like screamed, saying that she'd just passed through the wall into Peggy next door's bedroom. So when Peggy went next door to her own house, after telling Janet, like, try it again, see if you can do it again, she went up to the bedroom to see if, like, anything was out of place. And, like, this is, like, how much this activity had affected all of the people involved. Like, she was like almost expecting to see Janet right there in her bedroom. Which, if that had happened, like, that would have been like one of the most compelling pieces of paranormal evidence ever. Like, they were completely separate houses that were just joined by this dividing wall. Like, there was no way from one house to the other through those bedrooms. Obviously, Janet wasn't there. She was about to go next door and tell Janet off for like playing games and making things up when she noticed something lying on the floor by the bed. And it was a book. And it was one that she knew for a fact that she didn't own. But the Hodgson family most certainly did, because it was a copy of Fun and Games for Children that was 100% on the mantle of Janet's bedroom, like just a few minutes before. So how in the hell could that book have got into Peggy next door's house? So things showed absolutely no signs of slowing down, and by Christmas 1977, the poltergeist activity took a much more sinister turn. On the 23rd of December, both of the Hodgson's goldfish were found dead in their tank, with the Voice claiming responsibility for their deaths immediately, saying that it had electrocuted the fish by accident with its spirit energy. And on Christmas morning as well, Whitey the Budgie, who was the last surviving pet, was found cold and motionless in his cage. While he had been himself for a while, and it could have been a completely natural and just a coincidence, it was still weird that all three pets had died in the space of a few days. But then the entity seemed to turn its aggression onto Janet. She was sitting by the window in the living room when suddenly she cried out in utter terror and clutched at her throat. So similar to the film, one of the curtains had like wrapped itself around her neck and looked like it was trying to strangle her. And this is the thing, like the knocks, the thuds, the things moving about, this was still happening the entire time. It was happening so much that Peggy Hodgson referred to it as the nightly ritual, which, with Janet saying that she was just bored of it now. Like, I've glossed over it quite a lot, but it's all written out in Guy's book. But you do get the feeling that, yeah, like the bumps and the bangs, like they were just part of the house at this point. Like they were just so common that it was like, yeah, okay, whatever. Meanwhile, the press was continuing to like pump out this story and was especially interested in like the bit of drama surrounding like who was right, like was it a ghost? Was it just the kids? Like there was just this back and forth. But it was now April 1978, and this was 8 months after the activity had begun. The children were starting to report seeing an apparition of an old man in brown trousers, braces, and with a torn shirt on. Janet reported seeing him in her bedroom, and when she did, she ran downstairs screaming. And like even her mom was saying, like she was crying in fear, like it was a completely hysterical reaction with like palpable fear that's pretty hard to fake for a kid like that. And there were reports of spectral children in white nightgowns as well, with also like several shadowy figures appearing on the stairs and looking out the window, which I would just like, no thank you, that's your house now. Thank you very much, it's been lovely. It's yours, you can have it. Almost a year after the activity began, Janet's mother actually sent her away for like a full screening of like physical and psychological tests, like just trying to get confirmation that her daughter was in fact normal. Like there was nothing biologically going on with Janet. And almost 3 months later, Janet came home and the doctors had found absolutely nothing wrong with her. There was no abnormality with Janet whatsoever. Like her intelligence, her brain structure, personality, or the x-rays, they were all normal. No damage to her brain, no evidence of epilepsy, like nothing. There was nothing wrong with her. The months passed, and by like 1979, the activity had died down like just as quickly as it had started, really. And even to this day, like Janet maintains that while there wasn't as much like outward activity from then on, there absolutely still was some sort of entity in the house. And Janet's mom, Peggy, she actually continued to live in the house until she died in 2003. After she died, another single mother called Claire Bennett with her 4 sons moved into the home. And she claimed like she always felt like someone was watching her, like the vibes just weren't right. The kids would get woken up by like voices downstairs. So when she learned about the history of the house, she said, yep, that all makes sense. Completely understand why now. Like when she'd first moved in, she'd had no idea about what had gone on there. So there wouldn't have been any like, you know when you know somewhere's haunted and like you're almost like expecting something to happen? Like there was none of that here. Apparently, just 2 months after moving in, one of her sons woke up in the middle of the night and saw a man enter his room. And obviously, like, this was just the final straw for Claire. Like, they moved out the next day. Like, that was it. She was not entertaining this. After that, another family moved into the house, but they've never been identified. They don't want anything to do with it. They've never said anything about the house. And that was the last thing that I could find in 2015. What a story, right? There was so much more stuff that happened in the house. So, like, regardless of what side of the fence you sit on, I would highly recommend reading Guy Playfair's book on, like, the whole thing. And I'll put a link down below on where you can find it too. So what was different in The Conjuring 2? Well, I think the obvious difference is the level of involvement from Ed and Lorraine Warren. Like, in the film, they're seen as these, like, major players in the entire haunting. Like, they're there from pretty much, like, Maurice Grosse level, when in reality, like, according to the interview with Guy Playfair on Darkness Radio, Ed and Lorraine only turned up once to the house uninvited, and Ed actually pulled Guy aside and told him that they could help him make a lot of money on the back of this case. Bit suspicious. So, like, obviously Guy was like, no, like, fuck off. I'm just here to investigate it. I don't want to make money off it. Like, that's so shady. The other big thing that was the cornerstone with the story, obviously, in the movie was the nun, the demon called Valak. This had absolutely nothing to do with the Enfield case, and it's, like, probably just a way to bridge the stories together from, like, the Conjuring franchise and, like, bringing out the Nun movies and all that sort of stuff. But other than that, there are a lot of references to actual reported events from the film, with, like, Janet levitating through solid objects, and obviously the big man Bill Wilkins himself. And the house that was actually used for the on-location shooting of, like, the exterior of the house and stuff, that's only a couple of miles down the road from the real house, which is pretty cool. So what do you think? Hoax, paranormal activity, or somewhere in between the two? Please do let me know your thoughts down below. I absolutely love reading other people's opinions and ghostly experiences. I do firmly believe that it is somewhere in between the two. Like, there are a lot of corroborating reports of events happening that children just couldn't manage on their own, like ripping out a fireplace from, like, out of the wall that's cemented in. Like, I don't believe that the whole family would be covering for the kids as well. Like, they don't really gain anything by going out there and saying all of this was occurring. Like, they didn't make any money off the story. Like, Peggy Hodgson wasn't even angling for, like, a new council house and making the ghost story up for that purpose. Like, she stayed living in the house until she died. But, again, on the other hand, Janet and Margaret were caught multiple times faking events, and kids that young, like, of course they're going to thrive off the attention. So I think perhaps the kids' involvement in the activity was a little more than 2%, which is how much Janet claimed it to be. But I don't believe that it was all down to the family. I think there was definitely something paranormal going on there. But please do let me know what you think. And if you enjoyed this story, I would love you forever if you'd hit the like button, and I'd love to see you back here for another story sometime. So maybe, I don't know, if you fancy it, you want to subscribe as well? But that is all from me today. I cannot wait to chat with